Welcome back to the second panel of our Summer of Open Data. My name is Stefan Verhulst. I'm the co-founder of GovLab. And the Summer of Open Data is a 3-month-long series where we try to explore the third wave of open data. It is a series that is organized and produced by the Open Data Policy Lab at the GovLab with support from Microsoft. And it also involves partnerships with the Open Data Institute, the Open Data Charter, and with BrightHive, as well as with Data GovHub. Under the third wave of open data, we are specifically focusing on 4 areas that we believe might illustrate how open data can evolve. The first area is really around how can we make open data demand-driven, by which we mean how can we start thinking about publishing with purpose. The second area that we like to explore in this Summer of Open Data is to also how do we increase the uptake of open data at the subnational level. And we've made great progress at the national level, but clearly a lot of the data and a lot of the interest for open data resides locally. The third area involves the private sector, where we look into how can we, under the rubric of open data, also focus on access, functional access to data or insights that the private sector generates. And then lastly, we are also interested, of course, in how do we all do these advances in a manner that is responsible, and how do we increase data responsibility at the same time while we increase access to data. So that's in a nutshell what we are interested in, what the context is of the Summer of Open Data. And today we have a stellar panel with 3 experts that have worked on either open data or worked with open data or are working towards advance the access to data in the private sector. And I'm not going to introduce them because typically I do a very bad job in actually introducing the individuals and really illustrating what they are actually doing today. So what I will do, I will call upon each of the panelists to introduce her or himself, and then we can get started with really going into the meat of our conversation as it relates to the third wave of open data. But let me start with Denise. Denise, can you briefly share with us who you are, what you do, and also perhaps your interest and how it relates with open data?
Absolutely. So hello, everyone. My name is Denise Linn Reidl. I am the Chief Innovation Officer for the city of South Bend, Indiana. We are about an hour and a half south of Chicago and a few hours north of Indianapolis in the United States. A city of about 100,000 people and most well known for being adjacent to the University of Notre Dame. But our city has a great rich history. I would like to say we're, a small city doing big things, especially when it comes to technology and open data and performance management. So in my role as CIO, I am the head of our Department of Innovation and Technology. And our department, we manage everything from internal IT at the city. So we implement software. We make sure everyone has a device and the network is running. But we also advance open data, performance management, smart city work, and technology equity work broadly in the region in partnership with universities, local companies, national partners. It's a really interesting, diverse portfolio, and open data and data engagement plays a big part of that.
Great, wonderful. Thanks so much. Justine?
Hi, I'm Justine Hastings. I am the founding director of Research Improving People's Lives, Reidl, and a professor of economics at Brown University and a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And a lot of what I'm interested in, particularly through Reidl, which is a nonprofit tech for social good startup, is partnering with state and local government to help government make better use of its data and to provide those data to individuals, all in a secure and and in a secure way in compliance with privacy and confidentiality laws, but really to help government unlock the power of data to be able to create new innovative policies and measure their success. So our mission at Ripple is to use technology, data, and science to impact policy and improve lives. We do that in, I think, what is one of the topics we're going to talk about today, partnering with state and local government around a particular policy issue that's very important to them. But in solving that policy issue, and I'll get into some examples later, in solving that particular policy issue, we really make a point to build for government to solve that issue the technological and data capacity to both solve that particular problem, but to solve many more problems going forward. So for us, it's really about building capacity as well as solving immediate problems, so that we are kickstarting a culture towards data and science-driven policy and improvement for government and for the people that they serve.
Cool, brilliant. Thanks so much, Justine. Paul?
Sure, I'm Paul Coe, and I'm a data scientist at LinkedIn. I'm based in New York, and I lead a global team of data scientists and economists. We research issues relating to the global workforce from a very rich data set in the professional profiles of over 700 million LinkedIn members. And we call this our economic graph. It's a timely view and detailed view of professionals, companies, skills, jobs, and schools across the world. My team partners with organizations such as the New York Mayor's Office, to the World Bank, and also most recently with the ECB. And we do this in order to provide better detail on hiring, migration trends, career transitions, skills demand, and supply. And really my interest in open data is intertwined with the objectives of my team. We sit on a wealth of valuable information on the labor market, and my team's objective is really to help unlock that for public decision making. So a lot of our efforts are in this public sphere, and our aim is to actually create, provide this data into the hands of the people that can actually take action from this.
Great, cool. Well, as I indicated at the beginning, we have a stellar panel, and actually this is almost like the A-team of open data and the use of data to improve people's lives, as Justine indicated. So let me chime in on a few areas that we believe would be interesting to focus on during this summer of open data. And the first one relates actually with data at a local level. And I think, Denise, we've made, as I mentioned, great progress in at least advancing open data at the national level, quite often at the federal level, and a lot of the attention worldwide when people start talking about open data is quite often focused on national level open data portals. But obviously, a lot of the data and a lot of the value that can be generated from the data resides at the local level. So a question to you, Denise, is what's your assessment on how well we are doing locally when it comes to releasing data, especially data that governments have collected or are in their possession, and how can we accelerate this in a manner that open data becomes more of a default position at the local level than the exemption, which it still is in many places?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I think, major cities in the US, very large cities, I think have made strides on a subnational level to forward open data and open data culture in their cities. Before I moved to South Bend, I was in the city of Chicago, which is probably one of the, I'm biased, but I think they're one of the best, big cities around open data. And their former CDO, Tom Schenk, did a lot of great work on the open data front for Chicago. What's so interesting is moving from such a big city that was, Chicago was doing such innovative things with open data, releasing, a lot of data sets, and one of the biggest open data portals in the country. They were starting to work with private sector companies like rideshare companies to release data as well. And they were sort of thinking about all four of those phases or buckets of open data that you described, including data responsibility, in South Bend and in smaller cities that have perhaps less capacity, we're still modernizing a lot of systems in South Bend. You know, we're still, you know, we're kind of hosting guests in the house while we're building it in a way. And so it's a very different dynamic. And I would say that for a smaller city, the challenge is very different. So oftentimes in larger cities like Chicago, the narrative or the story of open data started just like what you said, with demand, sometimes external to the city, coming from civic technologists, coming from media, coming from nonprofits, having that influence government and modernize government, change resident expectations, and then facilitate the creation of more open data in the city that would then create actionable insights and would feed into kind of a larger ecosystem. And then I would say what's interesting is in a smaller city like South Bend, our ecosystem is still very much evolving. And so in a way, the city started doing this before anyone asked us to. And I think you sometimes see that in smaller cities around the US, where we're creating before there's demand, and then we kind of create the demand later. And so we are in an interesting situation where, you know, in the city of South Bend, our innovation and technology team started unofficially around 2013 and officially in 2015 under our former mayor, Pete Buttigieg. And then you know, we did it just because it was important at an executive level, and it was something we wanted to do. And, you know, right now we're sort of trying to lead with a lot of institutions to get local university partners, local nonprofits, local media to like use the data and to kind of interact with us in a way that I've seen in larger cities. So we've gone in a bit of a different order, I would say. And that's one thing I wanted to point out was, you know, I think subnationally, larger cities in the US have taken major strides in the past decade around open data. And you're seeing smaller cities do that as well. Mid-sized cities and small cities do that. One thing I think that's been enormously helpful when it comes to incentivizing communities to embrace open data are programs, national networks we have here in the US, like What Works Cities, Results for America, Bloomberg. Those have been essential for us, South Bend, as we've started to utilize those resources and then level up as a city. And we just reached silver certification this year for What Works Cities. And you know, a few smaller communities are also following suit. And so it doesn't always follow sequentially in the way that the open data narrative does in larger cities, but you know, I would say subnationally, larger cities have done very well, and smaller cities are starting to catch up and doing so in a bit of a different order.
And how do you, because one of the elements like at the subnational level is that everyone is trying to reinvent sometimes the wheel, while actually one could learn from other small cities, for instance. And of course, anyway, I think the networks that you mentioned are trying to do this kind of peer learning, if you can say, across cities. So how important is that, and do we have enough of that happening?
I would say we have a good amount of that happening, and there could be more. I would say we've leaned on official channels, like some of the best networks, in my opinion, are What Works Cities. I'm also a big fan of an organization called the National Neighborhood Indicators Partnership here in the US, which, you know, they involve governments as well as nonprofit open data entities that might be seated at universities, or might be nonprofits themselves. And one thing I think I've gotten out of that organization is been able to learn a lot from the projects that they do, the approaches that they've taken. We also, you know, lean on peer cities of similar sizes to us that might have similar budget issues or staffing capacity issues. And so One city recently that we've been talking a lot to is Asheville, North Carolina. They also use ArcGIS open data, and that's been good for us just because we could swap notes with them. But they're very similarly sized. They have a similar structure, and so we use those sort of unofficial relationships as well as the official national networks to help us, and it's been a really it's been good to lean on the expertise of peers as we've tried to evolve on the open data front.
Cool, great. So let's go to the to Paul, and so while we see great progress at the national and the subnational level with regard to open government data, Paul, you've been like a pioneer in the private sector with regard to how do we and how do you and your team leverage data that LinkedIn has collected or has in its possession in order to improve decisions at the public that revolve around public interest kind of questions. So a question to you, Paul. So how do you assess the current state of those kinds of private sector data for public good initiatives, and especially what do you see as a few of the challenges that you have encountered by doing what you are doing, and how do we take this into account moving forward?
Absolutely. So the past few months have been quite interesting. Right now, our teams are seeing more demand than ever for data in our conversations with federal, state, and local governments. Any information that's relevant is extremely welcome. So more detailed, more timely information can be critical, especially have situations that evolve so rapidly. The partnerships that we've engaged with traditionally have spanned months, if not years. In normal times, the labor market doesn't evolve that quickly. We don't have the luxury of actually doing that in this current situation. So we have to be much more agile. And so what we've seen in the past couple of months is a real acceleration of data partnerships, especially this sort of new wave of open data that we're seeing. And to Denise's point, major cities have made some major strides in their use of open data. And we've really seen, for example, here in New York, the New York City Recovery Data Partnership, in which LinkedIn is actually able to contribute and other corporations are able to actually provide open data initiatives. So we've seen accelerations on all fronts of this sort of open data initiative. However, it's been uneven. We don't necessarily see the same adoption because there is a patchwork of frameworks across the US. There is a lot of work that's been done, especially by the GovLab, in terms of actually providing out standardized contracts, negotiating a lot of these agreements. I think the luxury for LinkedIn is that a lot of this information doesn't necessarily have to be that sensitive. For example, our aggregated hiring rate, there's not very much sensitivity with that, so our legal agreements can be much more fluid in that instance. But I know for other firms, they have obstacles in terms of what they're actually able to share. And so those frameworks are really key. And I think there have been a tremendous amount of learnings that have really been surfaced up through this current situation that I think major cities have really been able to capitalize on. But I'm not sure if we see the same sort of adoption across the US. Exist. We see obstacles in terms of actually understanding what data is actually out there. Just because it's published doesn't mean it's necessarily discoverable. We see silos. It's kind of the trade-off between purpose-driven sort of initiatives and also centralized collaboration models. And I think this new wave that we're seeing will open up a whole host of new interesting questions about how we actually approach open data. How do we actually institute these sort of models as well? And we had this partnership with the World Bank, and data even there is encountered data is still very much locked up into silos. We encounter problems with discovery, knowledge sharing of data sets, and even findings. That's really quite difficult. There's also capacity building issues. There's quite a few researchers out there that aren't able to take our Python, our R code, simply because they're used to other traditional sort of technologies such as Stata, and aren't able to leverage a lot of our findings. So there's a little bit of capacity building on the side. But one of the really exciting developments that we've seen as well that's recently, I think that's led by the World Bank, and it's taking a lot of learnings from the GovLab, is a data development partnership that's being led by the World Bank. So really trying to standardize a lot of these data agreements in order for us to have this sort of portability with different institutions. For example, if we develop something that has been especially agreed upon with, let's say, South Bend, Indiana, we can actually easily have that same agreement to extend to multiple partners. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that anybody can start going in and start exploring the full wealth of data. Of course, there's some gates and controls associated along with it, but it gives us a common framework and starts moving to a place where data becomes much more open. So we have this acceleration that we've been seeing that really coming together that's been incredible. We still have a lot of work left to do.
Great, and so when let's go to Justine, and also Justine, I would love to get your reactions to what you've heard so far from Denise and from Paul. But specifically, I would love to get your reactions, given the fact that you're working with partners at the subnational level on what Paul referred to are capacity challenges, and specifically also challenges with regard to governance frameworks in which this type of work can accelerate. A lot of we always make, anyway, one of the initiatives that we have that Paul referred to is around actually data sharing agreements. And the reason why we felt that was important, because we always learned that it's already hard enough to establish a partnership, and then the lawyers arrive, and then it ultimately takes another few years quite often to actually get anything done. So what's the lesson learned from your work, Justine, and governance frameworks, those kinds of sharing agreements, and has COVID accelerated actually our willingness to deal with those hard questions in a much more agile way?
Sure. So just to give a little context to to what we do. So we are working with government partners to be able to help them unlock their data. So picking up, I know Paul mentioned silos of data and lack of capacity and separated data. So before LinkedIn comes in, you're in a government agency where you might want to do something like figure out how to reduce recidivism. And your own data are in a back-end system that is used for keeping track of which person is in which bed and how much good time have they accrued on each day, and what was, maybe some other area has their original charge. And if you just simply wanted to do a calculation that said, how many people are incarcerated right now and by demographic characteristic, it's actually an extremely challenging thing to do that would take like weeks of coding from that back-end data, right? And that thing is, that's a question that people want to ask and answer all the time. And you only have to write the code once if you did it correctly. And not only that, but if you did it correctly, you could have that code actually be software that runs, and so that you constantly transform your back-end data into a usable format for insights that's just ready in what we call a research data lake. So in this research data lake, you might take those incarceration data. You might also do something like take food stamp data or SNAP data. And again, that's got a really unwieldy backend that is made for keeping track of entries about cases, or when is a case, activities on cases and entries on cases and payments put onto EBT cards. And if you wanted to know at any one point in time, how quickly does the average person spend down their SNAP benefits within the month, that might take you 6 months of work to figure out. But actually, if you just made a feed of those data and wrote that code once as software, you could have a table that has the average spend down rate for each person on SNAP in each month, along with a lot of other information on them. And then what you might be able to do once you have this research data lake is you can actually do identity resolution. So kind of which person is which person, you can create an anonymous ID that links the SNAP data to the incarceration data and does that permanently. So it also runs as software. And now in this research data lake, you actually have joined administrative data across all government agencies. And at the highest table, you might have something that looks like the following: each person in a state each month, an anonymous ID, what government benefits are they on, what are the benefit levels, are they employed, what employer are they working at, what's their industry, what's their wage, are they on disability insurance, are they incarcerated or not, do they have a child, what grade is that child in, what school does that child go to, and what was their last standardized test score, and how many days were they absent last month. And now when I have something like that, if I wanted to develop an insight, which is something like, let's say, what predicts recidivism? I now can look at the panoply of social programs that I have, and I might discover that the strongest predictors of recidivism are whether or not somebody is quickly connected with Medicaid and SNAP benefits upon release. Now I actually have an insight where I can, using that predictive model, then go and actually implement a new program that connects people more quickly. And I could do that at some sites and not others, and then test if it's more effective. But I now have this data resource that can empower me to do that over and over again. So what we do for data sharing agreements and for doing this type of system is we actually have a cloud-based solution, a bunch of cloud templates that we've put together, CloudFormation templates. It runs on AWS. And we set up this cloud system for government along with all of the software that integrates their data and makes all of the derived tables for rapid insights. I mean, we typically do that around one particular question because you want a deliverable, a win, or a return for that time and investment that somebody can actually physically see how it works and get excited about using it going forward. So if you have this cloud-based solution, you can do something like a current project that we're doing with several states is calculating the returns, the causal returns to labor training programs. So we spend billions of dollars on labor training programs every year in this country to try to reskill Americans. This is now a crisis, but if you were to go to most state websites, you don't have any idea as a worker who needs reskilling whether that reskilling program is actually going to result in improved economic outcomes for you. What has it done for past enrollees? You have no idea. You just know what skills it claims to give, but you have no idea about quality. And neither does the government, by the way. A couple of training programs, or in a couple of governments, you might see something like mean earnings for people who have graduated from programs. But we know that publishing that type of information just creates incentives for cream skimming, right? It's like you just want to enroll and graduate people who would do well in the labor market, whether they got training or not. So actually what we're doing with these research data lakes is creating the correct value added measure and a prediction about, for a given individual, given their background, which programs do we think they will get measurable increases in labor market outcomes from. And we provide that to government and to individuals through a web and mobile interface. And that now all runs as software. We work with our government partners to learn the science and the code, essentially. So to Paul's point, we work with them to be able to actually take that code and own it and improve it going forward. So we're building capacity. And in that way, we are making data open, but in a scientific and usable fashion, as opposed to kind of just summary statistics, which I think are super helpful, but oftentimes something with predictive modeling and some econometrics behind it actually gives the best guidance to individuals, which is what we hope to do, to deliver data that's needed in a useful way at the point in time when it's needed. So to power all of that, you need, I think, data sharing agreements or data governance. So one of the beautiful things about using this web system, this cloud-based solution, is that government actually owns the cloud platform. So I don't actually have to sign a data sharing agreement with government. Now I sign a data use agreement. And government has complete transparency into what happens with those data. They have audit logs, they have, you know, all of these automated systems with really cool dashboards that we've made out of those audit logs so that they can see in a moment exactly where their data are, how they're being used, who's had access to them, and they have user access control. It greatly lowers the legal barrier to have a data sharing agreement, a data use agreement instead of a data sharing agreement. So that's one of, I think, the innovations that we've done to push that boundary. We all know that once you give data to someone else, you have actually lost permanent control of it. Because even if they sign an agreement that they're going to destroy the data in 3 years, you then have to enforce that. They could have made a copy and sent it. I mean, since Cambridge Analytica, I think we're all very aware that this is an imperfect model. But the nice thing is with cloud computing now, essentially you can have, you know, seamless, easy user access with the compute that researchers need, with the programs like Python, R, or Stata, or SAS, or Power BI, or Tableau on that cloud compute system. And you don't lose control of your data, which I think is key, but you are able to utilize it in partnership to drive decisions.
Great.
So that's really the approach that we've taken to handle the challenge of data sharing.
Cool, and it's brilliant to have actually to hear about 3 different models here under the rubric of open data, which I think is why it's so great to have this diversity of perspectives to show that it's a whole spectrum and that we actually have to become more sophisticated when we talk about open data, that it's not, you know, one extreme or the other extreme. And great to have you, Justine, reflect on different models where you actually provide more functional access to data in the form of a data lake. Question, and anyway, I have like 100 other questions, but I'm going to try to constrain myself and anyway, follow here at least the path to touch upon a few issues that I think I would love everyone's reaction about. And one is, of course, and again, it's also related to what I think Justine referred to. If we start reusing data, whether it's data that has been shared through a platform, or whether it's data that was collected through some kind of government program, or whether it's administrative data, the question that I always have is, of course, how do you then engage the citizens in determining, for instance, what the purpose might be, or at least understanding what their expectation is with regard to the use of that data. And going to Denise, I mean, you're also a Benton Foundation fellow, I guess, and you've written quite an interesting report on engaging citizens in innovation at the city level and elsewhere. And so how do you see citizen engagement in all of this taking place?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And that kind of goes back to sort of a principle or feeling I have about open data that I know a lot of other people share, that, you know, releasing data is not necessarily transparency. Transparency also means making data workable and accessible. You know, transparency means oftentimes working with your team or even external stakeholders to create products on top of data that are usable and user-friendly for your audience. And so there's lots of elements to transparency besides just releasing data into a void and having it be accessible at like kind of a bare minimum level. Another element that I think is evolving too, that kind of relates to the fourth bullet you mentioned early in this panel, Stefan, about data responsibility is thinking about how to engage residents in not only using open data, which we're always, thinking of ways to do that in South Bend, but also engaging residents in data collection policies at the city. Again, this is happening much faster in larger cities, but I'm always thinking about, as we as a city are deploying more technology in the public way that is collecting data in real time and passively, how can we, one, at the very least, inform residents about those products and tell them about how data is being used, how, even if it's not personally identifiable, how they are contributing to data collection at the city, how that relates potentially to public value, how that, and then where they can touch decision making on those types of smart city products. And so, we're thinking about that very intentionally now. Again, I moved from Chicago. In Chicago, things were moving much faster. And so I think a lot of cities were on the big cities were on the cutting edge of this, even before best practices were evolving, kind of on the data engagement front, as people were thinking about IoT and privacy policies. And so in a way, one of the blessings of being a smaller city and being a second mover is that we can learn from some of the best practices and mistakes that larger cities have made about how they've deployed those tools. And so, when I'm thinking about transparency and data responsibility, it involves engaging residents in data products, not only releasing data, but making sure we're doing as much as we can to turn open data into action, into actionable insights, whether that's partnering with a nonprofit or doing something ourselves. And then secondly, involving residents as much as we can in data decision making, and then putting on, very much the same sort of model or thought process that an urban planner would have if you were erecting a big building in your city. It's the same thing. You want to engage with residents about tough conversations about privacy, about data governance, about who hosts the data, if you're working with the university or with a vendor, what that looks like, adopting standards as a city around that. And a lot of cities are kind of figuring this out now, what this looks like, what procedural justice looks like. And I think this also plays into something I said before earlier in the conversation, where peer learning is so essential because this is a moving target issue right now. And so I know I've really benefited from gleaning wisdom from other cities, both similarly sized and larger, to understand what they're doing and how they're approaching those data engagement challenges.
Cool. And so, Paul, one of the issues that Denise raised, which also Justine raised, was this feedback loop, right? So how do we not only engage citizens to actually get their views or expectations with regard to data, but also how do you create data? How do you create value of the data for them? And so what's the thinking of the feedback loop at LinkedIn with regard to using data that can actually improve their lives? And that anyway positions the whole question of data and especially the reuse of data in a whole different light.
Absolutely. So I'd 100% agree on Denise's points on turning data into action. A lot of the points that Justine and Denise really resonate with some of the objectives of our group. As our group is very much demand driven, that means if we get inbound requests for our data, we're able to better support a lot of these initiatives. But it's not just that we get requests. Oftentimes it's, for a lot of organizations, it's data overload. They want to get their hands on any sort of data that's sort of possible, and they just sit on it. You actually have to demonstrate how it's being used, and that accountability structure in terms of the actions and the insights are actually taken from that, continue to help make the case with firms, public and private firms, that these are worthwhile causes to actually pursue. And I think for the incentive structure for LinkedIn, I think is really strongly aligned with a lot of these open data pursuits. The economic conditions to actually create economic opportunity to allow individuals to find jobs is the whole basis in which LinkedIn is as a platform is really able to successfully operate. If individuals are not able to find these opportunities, then LinkedIn as a platform has a lot of difficulty in terms of operating. So actually being able to take action from this information to be able to actually put into a public sphere and to actually socialize those learnings and not making sure it's not necessarily put up into those silos that I mentioned before is extremely important for our group. And I know for the groups of other firms that allow us to pursue open data initiatives like this.
Great, cool. And Justine, you mentioned in your describing of the lake that the insight goes directly to the individual. And so I think that's kind of an interesting aspect that quite often we forget or that we ignore with open data, is that it's not just generating insight that decision makers can act upon, which is of course very important. And also quite often, anyway, this loop from insight to action is quite often missing there, unfortunately. But I think it's very interesting to also hear that the work you do actually also just informs people in their daily decision making. And so what have you learned with regard to that feedback loop on how to design this in the best way, and especially from a, I guess, user-centric kind of understanding? What have you learned with regard to how do they want to receive this kind of insight?
So, just again, to talk a little bit about how Ripple is set up, we have both the tech, a tech team, and we also have, an econometric science group, but we also have a bunch of folks who really focus in behavioral science, so and user-centered design, surveys, meeting with people, understanding their needs and how they use things. And I think from the, not just from the work with Ripple, but the broader, body of research I've participated in literature, we know that the way that information is most impactful is when it's delivered in an easy to understand method at the time when it's needed. I think someone earlier said, although I'm not remembering here, it's like you see the information and it's just, you see it and you forget about it. But it's at that moment when you really are at the point of decision or you need it, you want it in your hand and you want to be able to kind of digest it very quickly. And then it can really empower decisions by individuals. I think about a couple of different types of users for the type of data we produce. One is, let's say that I create these return on investment measures for labor training programs. Policymakers are going to use that, and they may be interested in thinking about a successful program as being not just one that lifts wages, but one that lowers incarceration rates or lowers total social program cost. So they may have a different objective and a different calculation from that they're going to use, and they're going to want that available at the time when they make procurement decisions or when they have their kind of performance management meetings. For individuals, they're going to want to know what's my, nobody is going to want to see information on what's the expected decrease in the probability that you go to prison. That would be a very depressing statistic to look at. In general, I don't think that's how people make decisions. Instead, they want to know what's the increased probability that I have a job, and also what's the increased probability or what's my increase in wages. And I'm going to want to know that at the moment when I'm looking for a job, right? And not kind of have it somewhere that's not accessible then. So thinking about the delivery mechanism and also making the information easy to understand at the time of choice has a really big impact. A great example of this is we developed a bunch of a really successful program in Rhode Island called Road to College. That is a nudge-based app that helps children, low-income children in junior and senior years, stay on the path to college. And instead of giving them a scholarship, which it turns out, does not move the needle much on on enrollment. Actually, it kind of subsidizes people who would have already enrolled and often displaces federal grants, for example. It is $1,000 only. But the way that it's given, this scholarship, is an AI chatbot named Reidl gives you a task to complete each month at the same time that helps you prepare and stay on the path to college. So it might be making a college plan. Our college plan has an app where you search by return on investment for the schools instead of based on, like, I don't know, name or proximity or things like that. Or you study for the SAT, or you find you write your college essay. There are a bunch of things that you do each month, and it delivers to you, let's say, $20 gift certificate electronically if you complete your milestone, and then you get, you know, $60 saved for when you enroll in college. And when you enroll in college, you get kind of a lump sum. And this has been tremendously powerful at getting students to complete those milestones. And at the moment, it looks like we have had a significant impact on, even with COVID, the number of kids who have enrolled in and are planning to go to college. We quadrupled their study rate for the SAT. We also significantly increased the expected earnings per cost for the colleges that they chose to enroll in. And it's had this really big impact because, as the students say, it breaks things up into bite-sized pieces and gives me the information I need when I need it. Now, this cloud platform that I was describing for government, because it's running in AWS, for example, and I'm sure other cloud providers have similar services, essentially what government can now do is they can run these types of text message AI chatbot programs themselves from their own question bank using two simple management services that run in AWS. Amazon Lex, which is the natural language program that powers Alexa, and Pinpoint, which is an automated text message service. So what's great about that same cloud platform now is that it is not only a research data lake, but it's a mechanism for government to partner with researchers to really implement innovative tech solutions that deliver that information to individuals at the time of choice to really accelerate that feedback loop and impact.
Great. Well, I've learned a lot, Justine. This is a great example of indeed how open data, which typically quite often is seen, or data initiatives is typically seen kind of arcane and only for the nerds, really can make a difference in people's lives. And I think we should actually feature and name and fame those kinds of initiatives much more in order to, I think, broaden the awareness. I'm sensitive to the time here, and again, I could go on for the next few days here and ask more questions because you all have so much to contribute. So let me ask one more final question, which is the question I ask always at the end, which is if you would, if there would be one element that you that could change, what would be that element that could be that could make the third wave of open data far more transformative and also easier to achieve? And so what would be your priority area that you would want to focus on to make progress on, so that we could actually then achieve more from open data and also accelerate the use of open data? Paul, why don't we start with you to address that? And then Justine, and then Denise, you will have the last word.
Yes, I think in terms of actually looking forward and what would be transformative in terms of some of these open data initiatives, I believe the current situation and environment of COVID is actually changing public perception of open data, of how data is actually being used and communicated. I know there's certainly sensitivities on the side of the public in terms of how things are perceived. But I think hopefully there is a better understanding of how valuable information is, especially in such a rapidly evolving situation. So I think that public perception is extremely important, for especially for private companies to actually be able to participate in a lot of these open data initiatives. I think there's still a lot of sensitivities in terms of how we handle a lot of the information. I think there's enormous potential, especially the interesting studies that Justine was citing. These research data lakes, I imagine that in the future, private corporations would be able to conflate a lot of the data in the cloud and be able to match. Now, I could imagine a whole host of issues in terms of sensitivities. Formerly incarcerated workers, trying to match them against LinkedIn numbers and trying to understand better outcomes. There is an enormous amount of sensitivity with handling that kind of information. Right now, we're doing a lot of research in terms of job-seeking behavior. Certainly, if I'm a LinkedIn member, I would want to ensure that my data, especially if I'm currently an employer, is protected and responsibly used in terms of not having that information being surfaced back up to the employer. So I think being very sensitive to a lot of these topics is extremely important. Putting together these frameworks for eventually even putting together a greater commingling, compilation of these data sets would be extremely powerful. And I think we're still years off, I think, at this point of being able to fully realize that vision. I think the work that Justine, also Denise is doing in terms of definitely sets up the framework for us to be able to move forward in that type of direction. I think there's enormous potential, and there's quite a bit of work that's been done already. But again, I think that public perception, that trust, is something that needs to be maintained going forward, and it helps to have that demand. As long as the public demands that kind of use of data and to recognizes that value, that really drives innovation.
Great. Justine?
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that that really having, I think something that would be transformative is, kind of the stuff that you're doing, being able to show that those use cases that really work. I think there's so much out there that people's hopes get down, and they get worried. And we hear about that Cambridge Analytica, but we don't necessarily hear about the transformative work that's happening with high school students in Rhode Island and how powerful data can be. And I agree with Paul that this really, the crisis is terrible, but has opened a door for demonstrating how data can help. And also has, spurred people to be risk-taking a little bit and think about the possibility of success, and not just the possibility of failure. And so I think that to the extent that you can continue to find those successes with your platform and circulate them and give them a voice and make them available, I think that's fabulous and will definitely be helpful. And the more people can do that, I think the more we'll advance the ball. And Paul, we have actually found a really great way to use our cloud system, FYI, for combining private and public data so that the government can provide science as service to private training programs so that they can evaluate the success of their own programs against government data without exchanging confidential information. So I'd love to tell you more about that offline if you're interested.
Yes,
but I think it's a pretty unique solution that we've been really excited about, and we're testing it out with a couple of private training programs upcoming this year. So I think that's really promising and exciting.
Great. Well, I consider this call already a success. The fact that you've met each other. Denise, you have the last word.
Great. So from the perspective of government, and what I love about this question, I mean, what Justine and Paul have said, I think resonate. And we all come at this from different perspectives too. So from the perspective of government, if I had an open data magic wand, I would probably do two things. One, which is quite predictable, I think, and the other, I think, would surprise people. The first would be I would update all of the city's legacy systems with one just flick of my wand. I think, Justine, it sounds like you've done a lot of work with cities and states and governments. You've probably seen a lot of bad data coming out of old legacy software systems. And that work, implementing new solutions so that you can get better data and track better things that can then turn into, you know, the well-oiled machine that you're describing, Justine. I mean, that's the goal, but it comes at a price, certainly, and it comes with time as you sort of do that team by team, system by system. You know, we, for instance, the city of South Bend, we just implemented a new ERP during COVID. And, you know, that was a big feat for us, especially during this time. But now we have really great financial and administrative data to use. And we want to, you know, obviously apply that to all sorts of things so that we can integrate our CRM with like different data we're getting from trash collection trucks, yard waste trucks, with their kind of resident complaint and feedback loops, with code inspections and business licensing, and really be able to glean like those insights together. So I would do that, certainly, because that would just make my life so much easier. But the second thing I would do that I think would help a city like South Bend enormously, and lots of other mid-sized cities, would be, you know, I would actually love to see a lot of philanthropic dollars go to data intermediary organizations. And by that, I mean, you know, university research centers, local nonprofits. You know, I think that those organizations that take open data or take government data from their state, from their municipality, from their county, and they create white papers, they create maps, they create products. That type of work, those organizations are so additive, and they kind of they fill the function sort of quasi of a journalist, but then also as a nonprofit, because they are mission driven and they're advocates. And they provide very user-friendly, very actionable products on top of government data. And they can, just like media can, they can provide a very healthy counterbalance to government. And, you know, I'm asking, you know, hypothetically, for this money to go to those organizations, because I think a city like South Bend would really benefit from having someone like that in our ecosystem. We currently really don't. And right now, my team, we're sort of opening up the data, we're creating dashboards on top of the data, and we're trying to give them to nonprofits that don't typically use data. And there's sort of an organization missing in between us and them. And so I think when you think about a healthy open data ecosystem that really facilitates releasing information and making it actionable, I would love to see just some more capacity built all across the country, specifically in my community on that front. So those are the two things I would do.
Great, brilliant. Wonderful. Well, we've run out of time. Thanks so much for sharing your wisdom. I've learned a lot, and I hope that whoever is watching this is also learning a lot from this and turning this into action, because it's not only from data to action, it's also what we've learned here. How do we turn this into really the third wave of open data? Thank you, and stay tuned.
Thanks.